From our studios around the world, this is the Taste of Place podcast. Each month, we share stories from the keepers of culinary culture and heritage to spark ideas for your professional path or your next travel adventure. I'm your host, Eric Wolf. Thanks for listening. Welcome to episode 77 of the Taste of Place podcast. Today, we will be speaking with Sara England. Sara is the curator at the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Canada. With a background in history and museum studies, she brings a deep passion for storytelling, cultural heritage, and inclusive curation. Sara is dedicated to preserving and sharing the diverse experiences of immigrants to Canada through thoughtful exhibitions and community engagement. This episode is sponsored by the World Food Travel Association's Culinary Capitals program, recognizing unexpected yet fantastic food destinations around the world. Learn more at culinarycapitals.org. Hi, Sara. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me, how does a young woman from the province of Ontario find her way to Nova Scotia?
Yeah, it's been quite the journey. About 6 years ago now, I was living in Montreal, working at an Indigenous new media lab, which was great, but I was ready for a new adventure. And I had always wanted to visit the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And I applied to a job here. I have a background in curatorial. And so they gave me the job, and I came to Halifax having never been east of Montreal. So it was quite a journey for me, but really felt like a kind of coming together of all my interests and sort of personal connections. My Oma, on my mother's side, who's from the Netherlands, immigrated to Canada in the 1950s and came through Pier 21. So I really think our sort of the beginning of our family's journey in Canada started here. So to be able to come back after my Oma's passing, she never was able to return, but to come back to the place where our sort of family history began, I have that personal connection too. And then what we do at the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 as a National Historic Site telling the story of Canadian immigration is just a real honor to be able to participate in and tell those stories. So that's how I landed in Halifax and have been here ever since 2019, arriving just before the pandemic. So that was a bit of a curveball in my life plan, as I'm sure everyone else experienced.
Indeed,
as well.
Yes. New city, new province, and all of a sudden the world stops.
Yeah, it was tough, but we at the museum really pivoted quickly, and everyone, if you're familiar with Nova Scotia, we always took a very safe approach. So immediately we were working from home and masking up and keeping our Atlantic bubble. So it was a scary time, but a good place to work in compared to a lot of the other businesses out there who had suffered during the pandemic.
So for our listeners who are not familiar with Pier 21, would it be fair to say that it is kind of like Ellis Island is in the United States?
Yeah, that's a fair comparison. We're the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21. We're a national museum, and we're also a historic site. So we're in the building of Pier 21, which is an immigration terminal from 1928 to 72 that saw the arrival of almost 1 million immigrants during that time period. There are other immigration ports in Canada, but we are the only national museum that tells that national story. So we tell the story of Pier 21 as a site when it was active in the 20th century, but we also tell the story prior to that and after of Canada's centuries of immigration to Canada and how that's contributed to our country today.
Lovely. Well, I've actually been to Pier 21. We held an event in Halifax in 2010, and we were working with Taste of Nova Scotia to produce a World Summit. So we've been to your facility, and I remember back then it was very well done. It was a lovely facility, so I can imagine today that it's even more grand.
Oh, amazing. Well, I'm glad you have a bit of a reference. We became a national museum in 2015, so that meant a huge renovation, lots of upgrades, and then telling that broader story. So you'll have to come back and see what we've done, especially now that we have our new exhibition all about food.
Indeed, and I wanted to talk to you about that, food and immigration. That sounds interesting. Tell us about the exhibit and also the food aspect of the exhibit.
Yeah, so the museum has a new exhibition on display as of about a month ago in May, and it's called Eat, Make, Share, A Taste of Immigration. It's created by us and also presented by BMO. And it's an exhibition that's all about food and immigration. So we look at immigration through the lens of food and really think about how Canadian cuisine and Canadian food has been shaped over time by waves of immigration and those interactions between newcomers to this country and Indigenous people already here. So we look at how the people in Canada have contributed to the evolving landscape of Canadian food.
And I understand this exhibit just opened and it runs until when?
It opened May 10th and it'll run until January 18th, 2026. In Halifax. And then we take a little pause and get it ready for travel. And then it will actually travel across Canada for at least 5 years to different museums across the provinces and territories.
That's fantastic. Well, Halifax was a delightful town, and if someone's listening and has not been there, it's a fantastic holiday or vacation. I remember having some great food there, some great wines as well from Nova Scotia, which a lot of people don't think about. Lobster, of course, a lot of the lobster that's served in the States people think is from Maine, but a lot of it's actually from Nova Scotia. So it's those good old Canadian lobsters, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the food here in Halifax, especially as someone from Ontario, is just the region has such beautiful seafood and beautiful wine. I had no idea that we had amazing terroir, the wine people say, to produce such beautiful white wine and some reds too. So we're really lucky here and quite fortunate with all the delicious seafood. And actually, speaking of seafood, lobster, we talk a little bit about in the exhibition, or the idea of seafood and local foods being Indigenous. So the Mi'kmaq, if you think about eel harvesting and lobster, is an Indigenous food that's been harvested for centuries. And that's now seen as, a Nova Scotian cuisine, but it's been managed and used in cuisine for hundreds of years.
Yeah, Nova Scotia Halifax specifically is a charming destination, and Nova Scotia is a beautiful province. I think a lot of people haven't really, when you think Canada, you don't really think the maritime provinces. People think of Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal, perhaps. The bigger cities, those kind of iconic things, or maybe they'll think of the Rockies in Alberta, those kinds of typical icons. But the maritime provinces are really a gorgeous part of the world.
Yeah, I feel really fortunate to be here. Maritimes are a beautiful place to live, and it's true in the grand sense of Canada. I think the Maritimes gets a little bit of neglect, but those that visit, I think, see and know its beauty and just all the amazing restaurants, amazing cuisine, beautiful hiking trails, and we're just next. I'm 20 meters from the ocean. So it's a stunning place to visit for those who haven't.
So tell us some more about some of the food in the exhibit. You mentioned that lobster was included in the exhibit. What else would you include in the food and immigration list?
Yeah, there's so many. Maybe I'll start out by sharing how we sort of organized the exhibition and then from there thought about which foods and which recipes to include. So the exhibition is called Eat, Make, Share, and that's actually the way that we decided to structure the exhibition thematically. So Eat, Make, Share are sort of the core elements of enjoying food. We all eat it, we all make it, and that the love and gift of sharing food is so great. So we start out the exhibition talking about eating and look at first tastes in Canada. So the idea of the first meal and the first food experience that a newcomer has upon arrival, and just how memorable those experiences can be and formative in your idea of welcome and belonging. We also look at first tastes and the idea of Indigenous foods as the first food makers on Turtle Island. So there we're looking at things like lobster and eel, and on the West Coast you have salmon berries and huge orchards where they've cultivated things like hazelnuts for centuries. So that's how we start off the exhibition, thinking about first foods. We also look at the idea of hunger and hope. So hunger as a driving force for bringing people to Canada. As we know, there's famine and food insecurity at a all-time high, 6 consecutive years. The UN reports it just keeps rising, and we look at that with a focus on the Great Hunger, the Irish potato famine that brought over 100,000 Irish immigrants to Canada with a need to seek safety and come to Canada as a place of abundance and hope. And then in Make, which is our second section, it's a really fun section. We look at the idea of food remixed. And by that, we mean sort of how different cultures come together and fuse and remix to make new recipes and new ingredients. So we look at kind of classic Canadian dishes, and we have them all lined up in a recreated kitchen with a dining room table at the center. And on the dining room table are 6 dishes that many folks will know. And we look at the backstory of them. So some of those stories include the Jamaican patty, which maybe you're familiar with. So the Jamaican patty is centuries of kind of contributions from across different countries. So we look at like the British Empire and the Cornish pasty at the time. The Jamaicans took that and tweaked it and added their own spices and a Scotch bonnet pepper and the classic turmeric pastry that you see on the outside and turned that into a distinct dish. And then with my migration, that was brought over to Canada. And there's a whole fascinating history of the Jamaican patty and its arrival in Toronto and getting a lot of pushback, actually, because at the time, lawmakers were quite upset with the, I guess, flippant use of the word patty. To them, patty meant a burger patty, not a pastry patty. People actually went after these Jamaican businesses to try to get them to change the name of the Jamaican patty. And it was this whole legal dispute. Jamaican restaurateurs ended up winning and getting the legal right to use the word Jamaican patty. So they faced a lot of adverse experiences at the time and challenges. But, you know, today it's considered Toronto's unofficial food. It's the Jamaican patty. You can find it in every subway station in Toronto. So, you know, you can take a look at one dish, and from there, you know, we're spanning countries and centuries and then thinking about how it's come here and what it means today. So that's just one example of many dishes we have there. We look at bannock, pierogies, the California roll, which is actually a Canadian invention by a Japanese chef in BC. From Make, we look at share, which is a really fun section that gets into the idea of that emotional power of sharing food and what that means. So we look at festivals as a great way to share your culture and experience someone else's culture by attending a festival. And yeah, we have music and lights, and it's a really kind of engaging section. We also have a cookbook nook where people can go sit down and take a rest, sit on a chair, grab a book from the library, and we have an array of cookbooks that folks that are Canadian publishing, but speak to kind of diverse cultures and learn about different food traditions that way. And a whole bunch of other content to enjoy. But that's just a little taste of what we have through the ideas of Eat, Make, Share.
There's certainly a lot to choose from, and I have to ask, do you address butter tarts? Because I understand you're quite the expert at butter tart making.
I am, and well, the truth is, for butter tarts, I can only create a butter tart recipe for about 80 people. Any less, they're not great butter tarts. I've tried doing at home. So the backstory to my butter tart recipe is that I used to be a cook for a tree planting company in Northern Ontario. Which is often, tree planting is sort of a rite of passage for young adults in Ontario and other parts where forestry is a big business. So anyway, I was a camp cook up north for several summers, and hungry tree planters need a lot of food. So we were making a big dinner and then, you know, a carb-loaded dessert every night for folks to refuel. And the butter tart recipe was something that I would make weekly, if not twice a week, with sometimes margarine and things like powdered milk, because that's what you have up north. It ended up, you know, hungry tree planters don't have as discerning of a palate, but I ended up being able to get it right with the stability and that gooiness that you want from a butter tart. But again, in these large sheet pans that now when I try to make it at home, it doesn't end up as good. So butter tarts, yeah, quintessential Canadian food. We have at the end of the exhibition, and what we hope visitors to walk away with, we have a question at the end of the exhibition that we put forward, which is, what is Canadian food? So we hope through the exhibition, people are sort of thinking about that question, adding to it, maybe turning in their heads and maybe thinking a little bit more nuanced about what Canadian food is and could be, and how that might be a personal question depending on who you ask. So for some people, it might be a butter tart, and we have a beautiful photo of a butter tart next to that question about what is Canadian food. To others, it might be a Nanaimo bar or poutine in Quebec. We've been amazed by the array of answers that we get. The wall is filled with Post-it notes of people answering that question. And it is amazing to see just how personal it is. There's lots of Nova Scotian classics like Blueberry Grunt, which is from the African Nova Scotian community here. And so we see Blueberry Grunt, or something like Moon Mist, which is a popular ice cream flavor in Nova Scotia. But we also see things like tabbouleh or my mom's pierogi recipe, or things that you might not think of as typically being Canadian cuisine, but it is food made here, it is food brought here and enjoyed today. So it's that idea that Canadian food is constantly evolving and personal to depending on who you ask, that I think is what makes Canadian cuisine really unique, and go beyond the butter tart, but also include the butter tart because it's delicious and there too. So there's room for everything.
So I have to ask you, with raisins or without?
I did without raisins to appease the masses, but I'm pro raisin.
Oh, you are? Okay.
I
All right.
am. What about you?
I know about butter tarts because I've done a lot of work in Canada and have a lot of friends there. And when I lived in Portland, I was always up in BC. And the first time I had never heard of them, and someone said, something about butter tarts. And I said, "What's that?" And they told me, and they said, "Oh my gosh!" So they made me butter tarts, and definitely no raisins. They don't belong. No, they do not belong in it.
It's a big divide here, I will say. There's a lot of things about food, take the donair too. There's whether it has lettuce or not is a highly contentious issue in Halifax. And I'm sure in Ontario it's the same about the butter tarts. So wherever you go, there's disputes around our beloved foods.
So I have to ask you, in the state of Maine, there's a whole thing about the lobster rolls. So whether or not they're toasted, and also whether or not they have celery. How do you do your lobster rolls in Nova Scotia?
That's an interesting question. I think that all of the lobster rolls I've had have been toasted. In terms of celery, I haven't picked up on that. I wonder if that's like in Ontario, they do celery bread with pickerel at a restaurant that's been around for probably since the 1950s along Lake Erie Beach. So is the celery that kind of more of like a seasoning to the lobster, or is it added into the mix?
No, it's added into the mix. So you've got the lobster meat and the mayonnaise and any other seasonings, and then just chunks of celery. And for me, it's sacrilegious because it just conflicts with the taste of the lobster. And also sometimes people will butter the bread. So kind of if you're really a traditionalist, you'll use a hot dog roll, you'll toast it, you'll butter it, then you'll put the lobster on it, and then that's where the whole celery or not thing comes in, right there at that point.
Okay, I would say I don't think I've had a lobster roll with celery here.
Oh, that's good.
I think we're purists.
That's good. I'm a purist as well. It does not belong. Excellent. Oh my gosh. Okay. So let's see. So the exhibit's going on the road for 5 years. What cities is it going to be going to?
So it will start in Burlington, Ontario, and from there it will go to Moncton, New Brunswick, to the Resurgo Place. We have a few other locations booked. We're doing a West Coast tour. It'll be in Vancouver in 2028, and a few other sites there that we're working with. And then it'll be headed back east. My hope is that we can reach almost every province. That's the goal, so folks can see it at many places as possible.
Sure. So how many cities in total in 5 years do you estimate?
It will end up being about 15.
Okay. Well, that should give most people a pretty good chance to have a look.
I hope so. Our current exhibition is about refugees, and it's been traveling since 2019. And it's been viewed, we try to keep track of attendance, and it's been viewed by almost 250,000 people. So that's a fair number over the past while, considering the pandemic as well. So I'm hoping that with Eat, Make, Share, I think it's going to have that same resonance and interest. It's already almost been booked until 2029, and we haven't even started traveling the exhibition. So there's definitely a big appetite for exhibitions of this nature about food, about immigration. It's fun, it's family friendly, everyone can relate to food. And there's some great programming potential with it too, in terms of bringing in local chefs and home cooks and, animating family recipes again. So I think that the programming engagement and community connections will be really interesting to see in different provinces and how they kind of bring the exhibition to life, because that's just one piece of it. The other piece is, bringing in the audience and personalizing it to their region and their visitors.
So tell us about the coffin ship. When I was reading a little bit more background before the show started, and I touched upon the phrase coffin ship, and I thought that's a bit strange sounding. Can you explain that for our listeners?
Yes, definitely. So in the exhibition, when we talk about hunger and hope and the Great Hunger, which is also known as the Irish potato famine, we have an immersive recreation of a coffin ship, the interior lower deck of a coffin ship. And a coffin ship is a term used to refer to the ships that Irish immigrants would take across the Atlantic to arrive to North America during the time of the famine. And they're called coffin ships because they were treacherous, deadly voyages. Up to a third of passengers aboard a ship would pass away, either during that voyage over or upon arrival. There was a quarantine period where they might pass away upon arrival. So in places like Quebec, there are cemeteries with Irish immigrants who arrived and didn't make it off the island. So it was a terrible voyage. It lasted 45 to 60 days on sea. These ships were meant for cargo. It wasn't a very regulated business, especially with the British. It was a bit better with the States, but with the British, very unregulated with what the ship captain had to provide in terms of safety and health for the passengers. So they were cargo ships that held passengers, and they would bring back cargo upon their return. So it was really a money-making venture for most captains. There are exceptions. And if you can imagine, these people are hungry, are seeking safety and freedom and a chance for a new life in North America, but they're expected to bring their own food on board. They're given really, really meager food. Things like almost like hardtack, like a biscuit with water and oat or some sort of flour, and water that might be stored in casks that contain chemicals or previous liquids. So there would be a high chance of illness and sickness on board. And they were crammed in lower decks. So there was like little ventilation and sunlight during that entire voyage. They might be able to go up once a day to make a meal and get a little fresh air and then head back down below deck. So in our exhibition, we have the recreation of a coffin ship on the lower deck. So you'll hear the ship creaking back and forth. You'll hear waves crashing. And there's this song that we play of that we've found a recording of by Helen Creighton, who's a well-known folklorist in Nova Scotia. And she recorded an Irish person singing this song in the 1950s, and it's called the Famine Song. And so we have that recording in the exhibition, and it's a woman. The song is very heart-wrenching. It's about a hungry boy asking his mother for 3 grains of corn. So we have that alongside a baby crying. So it's quite an emotional, evocative piece. There's a gorgeous, huge life-size painting by the British artist Rodney Charman, who is a well-known maritime painter who does a lot of paintings of the Irish famine during that period. And so you can really get a sense of historically accurate of people kind of crammed in those tight quarters and what that would have been like for Irish immigrants. And it's quite a moving piece that really puts you in the shoes of one of those people and the kind of fear and despair and hope one might feel on board.
Sounds quite intense. I had no idea that it took 45 to 60 days from Ireland to Quebec.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine? It's just...
That's a really long time.
It's a really long time, and there were lots of kids on board. There were a lot of pregnant women. It was, as you can imagine, the death rates were extremely high. We have a reproduction of a letter written by a woman called Mary Conlon in 1847. She's on board the ship writing to her brother-in-law who she's supposed to meet upon arrival in North America. And she, in her letter, it's quite short, but just the amount of um, of loss she's experiencing is tremendous. In a few short lines, she says, "Brother, I need to tell you that my husband, John, your brother, went up on deck just yesterday and was hit by a wave and washed off the ship and has died." And in that same turn, she writes that she's pregnant and she has two other children on board the ship, and now they're fatherless, and that she's not sure if they're going to survive or make it. And they have a few more days left until their arrival in Quebec. And we find out later, this letter is still survived today, that Mary did unfortunately pass away, as well as two of her other children, but one survived. And that little girl then went on to stay in Canada and has a family of their own today. Over generations, her descendants are still here in Canada telling that story and have that letter. So if you look at the personal impact of what that just one woman's experience might be like, that wasn't a unique experience. There was tragedy all around.
4 of the 5 family members did not make it.
Yeah.
Wow, that's not good odds.
No, it's pretty heart-wrenching. But a lot of people did come over, and now there's massive Irish population in the Maritimes and elsewhere, where those Irish roots are celebrated today through,
and quite a bit
through
of
the
Scottish
music
too, I think, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of Scottish ancestry here. We look a little bit at that through bannock, which is considered to be and embraced by some Indigenous people as an Indigenous food that was brought over by Scottish fur traders. So bannock was then also something that Indigenous people started to create when the colonial governments at the time pushed people and forced them into reserves and ration their food. So they had flour and water, and they made bannock from that. So it's seen as something for some Indigenous chefs. There's a claiming of bannock as an Indigenous food, and there's amazing things like an Ojibwe-style taco in the exhibition that's bannock or fry bread with things like beans and salsa on top. And then there's other Indigenous groups who acknowledge its colonial legacy and don't necessarily consider it an Indigenous food and perhaps more of a European and Scottish food. So there's all that, there's complexity with that kind of history, especially when you're looking at colonialism. So it's interesting to see just the diversity of interpretations and ways that people connect to different foods that way.
So let me ask you, the exhibition has to do with food and immigration, and yet you have an Indigenous component, but the Indigenous people were already here, so they did not immigrate. They were already here. So how are the Indigenous influences incorporated into the exhibit so that it makes sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. And that was something we thought a lot about at the beginning, is how do we ensure that this is something people understand as part of the story? It was really important for us to include and what our Indigenous culinary experts and consultants that we worked on the exhibition told us was important to share. So we really strive to respect that. And why we do it is because Indigenous people have been here since time immemorial. The lands that we live on today and we eat, cook, and grow on are thanks to Indigenous people. So when newcomers come to Canada and encounter Canadian food and also make contributions to Canadian cuisine, oftentimes what's seen as Canadian food is actually Indigenous food that has been here for centuries, like the wild blueberry or salmon or maple syrup. Those are all Indigenous foods the example of maple syrup is an Indigenous invention that was passed on to settlers to aid in their survival here, that actually helped them survive because it's so nutrient rich.
The maple trees are there, right? So
yeah, exactly. And they would be dehydrated into sugar bricks that were a trade item and a way to store over the winter. So we have to talk about that interaction because it is so significant, both in the past in terms of helping settlers survive and exist, but also prior to that, like Indigenous people have such long-standing rich traditions that have been impacted by the arrival of immigrants and colonization that are now being revived. And and celebrated by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So it is a really important part of what Canadian food is, and those interactions between Indigenous people and newcomers that really uniquely make Canadian food what it is today. So we look at both, the impact of immigration on Indigenous food, but also the contributions of Indigenous foods on Canadian cuisine and immigration. So it's nuanced. It's not an easy story, but throughout the exhibition, we feature different stories like maple syrup and the colonial destruction of the buffalo, which had a huge impact on Indigenous groups in the West, and then to things like spruce tips and spruce beer, which is very popular here. Especially right now this season, spruce trees have their new growth on them, and you can actually take those clippings and turn that into tea, or in some cases people make spruce beer or a fermented spruce drink that's incredibly like vitamin C rich, that's been used since the 1600s. Prior to that, when the arrival of the French, with the French, the Mi'kmaq imparted this knowledge to actually save them from scurvy. We tell stories like that a lot. Kind of, you can span spruce use of over 400 years, aiding in kind of settler survival. So there's a lot there.
I was just in Sweden and Finland in the northern parts of those countries, and I did meet with some of the Sami people who are the indigenous people up in the Sami nation, which other people might know as Lapland, but they don't like that term. So it's the Sami nation. But in the northern half of Sweden and Finland, they do the same thing with the spruce tips. And I'm wondering if that is historic knowledge that came from the indigenous people, that somehow the Sami in the Nordic countries were in communication with the tribes in North America. And maybe this is all part of some ancient history.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, definitely be a question for one of our Indigenous culinary experts. But that long-standing Indigenous knowledge is incredible, and just the ingenuity and it's not easy to survive here in the winter, and tough terrain. We're very rocky over here as well, and people just find ways to survive, and more than survive, to thrive and create abundance. That's with what's already here. So it's pretty incredible.
And to think, I mean, of course, it makes perfect sense when you say it that maple syrup is an indigenous product, but I had never thought of it that way, and I think that's the big takeaway for today. That maple syrup, this family favorite that's everyone knows, is actually from the indigenous people. That's tremendous.
Mm-hmm. I hadn't thought about it either. It was one of the takeaways for me too when we embarked on this exhibition research. It sort of blew my mind that something that's so quintessential to Canada, and what you think about with Canadian food is Indigenous, and so much embedded in specific nations' culture and idea of seasons, and even language around seasons is connected to the maple tree. So there's a lot of cultural significance when it comes to maple syrup, and Indigenous maple syrup producers today that we look at. We sell maple syrup in our gift shop from the Wabanaki, a maple producer. That's a women Indigenous-led company. So there's people still practicing and turning that into a kind of a commercial business today. So keep an eye out for those kinds of products.
That's great to hear. It's interesting. In a lot of the newer countries in the world, so obviously Canada, United States to some extent, although lesser because it's such a huge country, but also Australia, New Zealand, these countries are, well, in the past 20 to 50 years have been struggling to try and find their culinary identity. And I think Canada actually has done a really good job trying to carve out its own identity, although each province has got its own little nuances. But I think that your exhibition will only help to further define and clarify what Canadian cuisine is, because that had always been at conferences. I remember that we had our first conference in Victoria in 2004, and the Canadian Tourism Commission at that time was the name. They sponsored the conference, and there was this whole discussion about what is Canadian cuisine. And we had people like Anita Stewart who spoke, and it was just really difficult for people to articulate what Canadian cuisine is. And I think today you are closer, much more defined and clear about what it is. But I still think there's some runway in front of you to help define that into the next century.
I agree. It's such an interesting question, and I think the kinds of responses we're getting today are going to be different 5 years from now when this exhibition's still traveling and we're getting responses from folks maybe in the West Coast who have a whole different set of answers. And, we feature a lot of different chefs throughout the exhibition who are doing interesting things with food. And I think I imagine being a chef in Canada can feel quite liberating because there is so much freedom to evolve and play around with cuisine because it is so expansive that, I'm really excited to see what the future holds for Canadian food and what that looks like to people 5-10 years down the road.
Well, keep doing what you're doing. You're doing a great job, Sarah. I, for one, admire the work that you've put into this exhibition. I can't say that I'll be over to see it unless I have a trip planned to Canada, but it sounds truly impressive. And we will put the link to the show in the show notes. So anyone listening who happens to be around and available can certainly come in and have a look and learn other things like maple syrup originally came from the Indigenous First Nations people.
That's great. The visitor response has been really fantastic, and I hope we see more folks out there from all over when they're planning their summer or upcoming vacations for the year. They should consider coming to Halifax. So thank you so much, Eric. It's been really great to talk to you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. That's it for this episode of the Taste of Place podcast. This episode is brought to you by the World Food Travel Association and its Culinary Capitals Destination Certification Program. We'd like to hear from you. We invite you to share your ideas, questions, and thoughts about the podcast by contacting us through our website, or you can connect with us and comment about the episode on major social media platforms. Special thanks to our guest, Sara England, and our sincerest thanks to you for joining us. I'm Eric Wolf, wishing you a safe, happy, and productive month ahead.